Good evening. Welcome to Jive Talk. I've got a great guest for you this evening. He's an expert in Germanic linguistics and runology. What's more, he knows a lot about semiotics and folklore, specifically Northern European folklore, and he is a practicing Germanic heathen, but of a continental variety. I'd like to welcome onto Jive Talk, Dr. Scott Shell.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Today we're going to focus on specifically runes and their magical uses in the questions. But on his channel, you can actually find that Dr. Shell covers a wider range of topics, including folklore and some looking at archaeology. And perhaps you'd like to tell the audience a bit about yourself as well, so they know what to expect.
Yeah, sure. So I started off, got a bachelor's degree in German. And after I sort of stuck to that path, I then pursued linguistics at Wayne State University. Then I sort of zeroed in on Germanic linguistics when I got into the program at Berkeley, and that's where I got my Ph.D. So there, basically every class that I took, any paper that I could write, was always focused on something runic, whether it was for Gothic or Old Saxon or Old Norse or Old English. It didn't matter. It was anything runic. The channel itself, the YouTube channel, sort of bridges a couple things together, though. It sort of brings that academic side of me in, and then it also tries to offer perspectives, basically, on how you can put things into practice. So that's why I have so far, for example, focused on understanding a better worldview for the Saxons and understanding, how it was that they thought. And I do all kinds of different translations, of course, for the Halion, which is a 9th century retelling of the Gospels, in which case is not so much Christian as much as it is Germanic heathenry. And of course, yeah, like I said, I focus on anything that's particularly runic. I wrote my entire dissertation on the Elder Futhark system and tried to basically expand from Flowers when he wrote his dissertation in the 80s, and focused on the elder inscriptions along with semiotics and trying to define magic.
Could you quickly just briefly explain what semiotics is for those who aren't familiar with that term?
So semiotics is the study of signs. There are a couple different schools of semiotics. Two of the major ones are Saussure, and who believes in like the duality of a sign, and then Peirce, which is what I follow, which is basically a triad. A sign makes up a triad. But for the simplicity, for this target audience right now, it's just basically the study of signs and symbols and how they kind of fit into an overall context. So the other important thing, though, too, is that like the reason why semiotics helps me with my dissertation is because the Persian tradition, which I'm trained in, they would not be able to separate the runic inscription from the material that it's written on and separate it from the purpose of something being carried out. That all has to come together for an interpretation. Whereas just kind of a linguist who wants to look at just the language will ignore everything else except for what they believe it says. So I tried to bring in like a holistic interpretation of some of these inscriptions, and semiotics kind of helped with that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I thought I'd read your dissertation because I heard that you said in one of your videos that you had a dissertation about runes and magic. But then I realized I hadn't. I read an essay called "Applying Magical Communication to Semiotic Runology," which I understand is a brief summary of some of the themes that are addressed in your dissertation.
That's basically just kind of a small chapter from the dissertation, in which case it's just trying to talk about runes and magic and the issues with runes and magic. But the actual dissertation is going to be published through Peter Lang. I got confirmation this morning that it's supposed to be out before December 9th. So I'll be sure to, send you a link to it. And, you can let anyone else know, too, if they want to go ahead and read it. But it's called The Application of Persian Semiotics to the Elder Futhark Tradition, Establishing Parameters for Magical Communication. So kind of like a standard typical academic title. But so it just sort of, tries to tackle those issues.
So there's some big issues in there, though. Sorry to ask such a big question, but Are runes magic, and what is magic? Can you try and summarize that as briefly as you can?
I'll try to give it the best I can. Like, so first off, are runes magic? I just wanted to say,
Or were they considered magic?
no, it's fine. It's just the
Sorry.
thing is that based on my experience, just giving talks at conferences or just talking to some friends who are practitioners, if I say yes, like holistically, they're all magic, every academic will throw me under the bus. If I say no, then some people who are practicing are kind of like, well, of course they are. But then the academics are now listening to me. So it's like this weird thing. So basically, what I found is that while I was studying these inscriptions, I was also looking into theories about what magic meant, and I just discovered that there are so many articles and so many books in so many fields trying to define magic that we don't even know what the heck it really means when we use it in like an everyday context. And so I found out later that when I would go to these conferences, and they would talk about magic, what they meant was just a lot of times was like something they can't explain. And I'm like, well, that's not what I mean. So basically, to the runologists, the academic runologists out there, I say they can represent magic, but let's talk about what we mean by that first. Do we mean defining magic in a sociological paradigm where the person who's carrying this thing out is actually asocial and sort of pushed away from society, the one who kind of lives, out there on the edge of town, who no one really goes and talks to unless they need some help, like magically or medicinally? Or are we talking about someone who needs to vent emotions? The previous one was actually the schools of Emil Durkheim and Marcel Mauss, and the venting emotions is more of like a Malinowski approach, like, oh, they want to do this to just sort of like vent these emotions. But then you also have someone like Fraser, who says, he's a little bit older, but I think his theories are very valid. He says basically in a society, you have in the beginning, you have them practicing magic, and then they develop into religion, and then they develop into science. I find that kind of weird. And he also says that they're all a bunch of idiots. He literally calls them dumb-witted savages in the beginning. So that's not particularly useful. But some of his schools of thought, like sympathetic magic, meaning like, I touch something and then someone else touches it. There's a sort of like continuation of like connections, that somehow there's a connection there and you can use magic that way. Or if it's like produces like a metaphor in a sense, that can also represent magic too. So in other words, you have something that looks like something else, you do something to that object, the other object is impacted. So that's also extremely different though from when I just talked about the asocial character. So again, what I'm trying to get at here is that with runology, magic was never really defined. So Stephen Flowers is only like the only person who really tried to define it and put it into a runological context. So basically, when I would go to these conferences, they would think I was a joke. They would be like, oh man, this guy wants to talk about runes and magic. I got it in my own department. And the only person who really supported me was my advisor. And, it was just kind of like, here goes Scott. He's going to be talking about, expecto patronum crap or something like that, or Wingardium Leviosa, or, like Harry Potter stuff. And I'm like, no, I'm trying to actually make it to where magic is not looked at subjectively when we're talking about these things. I was trying to put it in the objective and be like, okay, go ahead and attack the argument. Don't attack me. So if you don't like what I have to say when I define it that way, then we can make a better definition or set better parameters. But I'm just letting you know that it's not me personally trying to connect that way in an academic setting. So those are some of the issues that you faced.
Because my understanding, without having a great knowledge of the climate of academic runology, is that it's accepted that some runic inscriptions certainly are magical, intended for magical purposes, whatever definition, meaning that the majority are for profane, and that's how wrong or correct am I in thinking that?
I think you're right in thinking it, but I just don't agree with what they say about that. So I
Yeah.
think that the oldest runic inscriptions are the most sacred, the most, and basically the further along you get into, like, especially the medieval period, the more runes kind of become more profane in the sense that everybody's now carving them. You now get so and so was here. You get like somebody creating lists of items and stuff like that, but in the oldest runic tradition, you get these
Erelaz.
inscriptions, which what's that?
Well, the
Erelaz?
earliest one is often attributed to, they're usually the Erelaz. They
Yeah,
describe.
exactly. The Erelaz or the Rune Master. I still adhere to
Yeah.
that term. Yeah, and
Mm.
they are generally more sort of sacred in the sense that they are meant for usually like for religious purposes or magical purposes, however you want to define that. Um, but in that sense, oh, and also because you brought up the Erelaz, they are all most of them are actually carved by an Erelaz. So
Mm.
you find that again up in the north, but again, that tradition starts to sort of fade away from the younger Futhark going into the later medieval period. And so don't get me wrong, runes were actually used, in the medieval period for like rune magic, but just maybe in a different way.
Mhm.
So that's my take on it briefly.
So, to talk about the less ambiguously magical kinds of runic
Hmm.
purposes for runes, we've got curses, invocations, and then these sort of nonsensical words where they get these
Hmm.
jumbled collections of runes that can sometimes make pronounceable words, but they don't appear to mean anything. And are those the main kinds of runic magic, or do you think there are others that should be included?
So the thing is, if we're just going to talk about curses, there are some, of course, with like don't touch this or don't break this, or you're going to be subject to perversity, or however you want to define ergi. But in the earliest inscriptions, again, it's not just about contacting something or touching something, and then you're sort of subject to a curse. What we need to look at, for example, is all of the beautiful alliteration which is actually used for magical purposes in these inscriptions. So if you look at the Bjorkatorp stone, for example, there's alliteration everywhere, all over. It's a beautiful poetic piece. And it's actually tied to myth too, because it talks about like bright runes being, being represented there on the stone. And basically, I argue that the alliteration, the constant alliteration, helps the curse because it's all part of the ritual act. So basically you touch something, you break it, you're impacted. That's only kind of part of it. So for example, I mean, even as little kids we would say like, rain, rain, go away, come again another day, sort of thing. And it's like almost as little kids, like we want the rain to stop, right? And so we think that that'll help. And if you listen, it's actually what I call phonetic repetition. Rain, rain, you have the phonetic repetition, but you also have the semantic repetition where it's just repeating the word, repeating the word, repeating the word. And so if you look into some of these oldest runic inscriptions, you'll see that a lot. The alliteration is the constant phonetic alliteration. And then you'll see words constantly repeated too in some inscriptions, not all. So that's why one of the most controversial inscriptions I think I addressed in my dissertation was the horns of Gallius. I actually said that it was a magical object. I mean, so unless I define my parameters and I talk about why that's a magical object and why it's tied to ritual and how the alliteration on that horn helps the magical purpose, and it's actually arguably even tied to Indo-European with this particular runic formula, that can all be tied into magic too. So it's like you got the poetry, you have the repeated words, and you have the intent, and of course you have to focus on the material it's carved on too. So that's the semiotic aspect that you have to bring into the argument as well.
Well,
That's kind of part of the answer, but yeah, sorry.
I remember an argument that the alliteration, I think it was from Hilda Ellis Davidson, alliterative naming of children may have been an earlier form of the later practice where you give the name to a child in order to encourage the reincarnation of an ancestor. But because that seems not to have been done earlier in Germanic cultures, she argued that alliterative names may have been an earlier form of that. So it would reinforce what you're saying about alliteration itself having a magical function in that
Oh,
culture.
definitely. I mean, and we even see, for example, in like Fafnismal, where we are specifically told that Sigurd won't reveal his name to Fafnir, the dragon serpent, because specifically they believed in those days that if you could sort of take control of someone's name and use it somehow metonymically, I guess I would say, part for whole, you could actually impact that person. You could somehow have some sort of control over them just by even
Right.
uttering the name. We take
Like
it for
Beowulf is
granted.
reluctant as
Mhm.
well. Beowulf is reluctant to give his name when he lands in the shore in Denmark for the same reason.
Exactly, exactly. We kind of take that for granted nowadays. We don't kind of look at the word as so sacred. But going back then, again, not everybody was literate. Not everybody could read and write. But I guess in that aspect, it's more of an oral, uh, tool, I guess you'd say. But yeah, the other thing was too is you asked about the unpronounceable names.
The nonsense words
So
and
yeah,
names and things like that.
what I would say is it's kind of hard to find that in the elder inscriptions. I mean, you can find them, but what happens is that if it's like a series of runes that don't quite make any sort of phonetic sense, like sounds like Scott, Tom, then a lot of people will say like, oh, it's magic. But then you have the runologists coming later, especially people like Elmer Antonsen, who will come later and say, well, that's just nonsense because it can mean this, this, and this. So it's kind of hard because there's no like title that says like this is for, a magical inscription and it's a nonsense word. But what I wanted to bring up is that those practices were alive though. So it's not completely out of the question to say like, yes, this was actually meant to confuse a wight or a demon or something like that.
Yeah,
And so I'm going to give you an example real quick. So
yeah,
there's this one is actually from Old High German, which I think is dated to about the 8th century or so. And it is the title is in Latin. It's Ag signandum domum contra diabolum, which means for signing the home against an evil spirit. So for those of your listeners who are actually interested again in these practices, it's literally documented here. And so if you want to protect your home from a wight of some sort, here you go. So we have wola wisht das du waste. Notice right there too, alliteration. Wola wisht das du waste. You have alliteration already right there. Tas du waste hasest. Tas du waste noch Nechanskedan in a word I cannot pronounce, but this is why. So the translation is, well, spirit or white, you know that you are called white. However, what you do not know, nor can you say, is this word, which is spelled Chnospince. And it's supposed to be non-pronounceable on purpose because what's supposed to happen is that this wight or this demon is supposed to try to say this name and then it gets all confused and flustered and then it just like runs away. So we already have evidence right there for alliteration and trying to use confusing clusters to have the demon sort of get confused and leave you alone. So why not transfer that to runic inscriptions too? I mean, depending on the context again as well. So,
certainly. I can think that could be at least one of the
yeah.
functions of them. I
Oh yeah.
know that. I mean, abracadabra. I think of that a lot in like
Yeah.
terms of magical terms that just don't have any actual meaning. And I don't. If
Right.
you'll allow me to, I
Of
read
course.
this earlier today, which is not about Germanic heathenry, but I just thought it'd be relevant to this question.
Mhm.
The Neoplatonists were arguing about the use of the nonsensical names that were used in
Yeah.
invocations. Porphyry said they shouldn't be used, because they're unknowable, and
Yeah.
but then Iamblichus argues they're not meaningless. To the gods, they are meaningful, but not in a way that can be described or in a manner that is significant or indicative to men through their imaginations. These
Yeah.
names, he continues, were revealed through the intellect of the gods or remained completely ineffable. But basically,
So
obviously,
no,
the
I
difference.
already know 100% what you're talking about, and I find it fascinating. And the reason
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about is because I actually cited a lot of that in my dissertation.
Oh,
That's
nice.
yeah, exactly. So no, it's very relevant. So with the Greek tradition, you have, for example, like in the Greek magical papyri, you
Mm.
have like these instances where people are literally becoming gods through these ineffable names, you know, and these names that they can't even fully pronounce because it's somehow divine language. So yeah, of course. I mean, I think that's another great parallel. You know, that's also what ties into the argument of like the Lindholm amulet. It says like, I am the rune master, I am called the crazy one or the wily one. And I don't believe it means the sunny one based on a linguistic argument. But what I'm trying to say is that the ek erelaz, or the I, the rune master, is the I am the one who rises up. That's what the er prefix means, at least according to Jan de Vries. And now I am called the crazy one or the wily one. And essentially he goes on to take up a sort of like higher being or a higher self. And so if you want to compare that again to the Greek material, it's right there. So, you know, they don't believe that they are the god, that they believe that they're sort of like emulating the god in a sense.
Yeah, that's I mean, universally, that's often a form that magical, or maybe magic is even a really difficult word to use in religious studies too, because often people try to distinguish normal religious activity from magic, and some people, I mean, a lot of academics say there's no way you can do that clearly, but sometimes it is useful because there are things that are like more, you know, like basic worship of a god, and there are others where you're trying to change things. So there are sometimes useful as a shorthand to distinguish magic from other religious practice, even though there has to be a caveat that it isn't really a clear-cut thing. But there is this tendency to do exactly what you described, where the practitioner essentially becomes the god. And this is something the Iamblichus of theurgy involves. Like theurgic magic or whatever, they order the gods around, which other Neoplatones say you can't order a god about.
Right.
And the Iamblichus says, no, I'm actually not ordering. It's not me ordering the god about, because at that moment I am a god who is qualified to order a lesser god around. So it's sort of,
I mean, and I find it so. I kind of look at this as a case of synchronicity, because I'm also listening to Schwepp lately, if you're familiar with Schwepp.
Yeah, I love it.
History. I know. So you're talking about Iamblichus and everything, and I love his stuff. So actually, I'm able to follow you a little bit, at least, with exactly what you're talking about here, with the comparing of the traditions. That's really cool.
So could you elaborate a bit more on this, on the way that the runes indicate that the runic the rune master is himself embodying another being, or
well, the thing is with the ek erelaz formula, like I said, the er means to sort of rise up, to sort of go into a different state of mind. And again, that's what it's connected to. And when you see a lot of these ek formulas, and Stephen Flowers actually talked about this a lot in his dissertation. When you see a lot of these ek formulas, it's usually a plus, like ek erelaz plus a byname. So it's like they're always called like an erelaz, but they also are called something else, which is like, you know, it doesn't usually come up to me as a personal name anyway. Like, again, with the Lindholm amulet, it's like, I am called the crazy one.
I am the owl or raven or something after.
That I am the raven is a different inscription, but that's another example though too. No, Tom, that's exactly another example where it's like, I'm called the raven. But like, for example, I've looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Old Saxon personal names. There's nothing in there about being like the crazy one. I can't really think of like a common name like that in the Scandinavian languages either. But like, my whole point is that he's kind of becoming something else and rising up to do something else to carry out this crazy deed. So for example, with the Lindholm amulet, and we put it into a better context, it says, you know, I am the erelaz, I am called the crazy one. There's an ek formula on both sides of the inscription. So it's actually the I portion is very much focused. And then on the back side of the amulet, you have a series of runes, which are clearly, in my opinion, used for magic, because you have a lot of repetition there, for example. But, you know, what's interesting about this though, too, is that it's actually carved on a bone, and it's shaped to look like a fish or a serpent of some sort. And then it's thrown into a bog. So that's not exactly, how is that like profane. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
sending something out. There's obviously an intention there. A very
yeah, yeah,
clear
exactly. And I'm not denying that some runes were used for profane in a profane manner. I mean, most definitely. Like I said, there's graffiti and stuff later, but like we can't discount the obvious magical uses and the obvious ritual uses regarding these objects. And also, I mean, it was shaped like a fish on purpose. Like I don't know if that actually brings you to another question regarding
Well,
material.
I mean, I did have my own. Wasn't going to mention the fishing, but I commented on one of your videos the other day that I have a theory of my own that fish. There is a lost myth that Odin becoming a fish, because there's these fish in Anglo-Saxon sources. Two Anglo-Saxon examples of a fish between the two ravens, and the two ravens often used in other contexts are associated with, the two birds.
Right.
We can't identify their ravens, but it seems to be a Odinic thing. And then there's also yelling Bracteate, where next to the figure that's often elsewhere seems to be Odin based on the inscription runes next to it, saying things like the high one, or Wodenaz on the more recent one. There's another little figure with a human head attached to the body of a fish, so it looked like literally something transforming into a fish. I think that, so this another question, I think,
sure,
because you've used flowers in your dissertation, and he says that mode of magic is transformative, and the rune master assumes the role of a god while creating inscriptions, as I said a bit like earlier. And then he wrote, the rune master does not invoke the god but acts in the role of the god, and he participates in the function of a god in a ritualized sense, or at least he is employing an operative technique which is considered to be the gift of the god. So this is
so that ties into basically everything that we were just talking about. Exactly.
And the wily, you were saying the wily deceptive one. What is this other word that goes alongside Erelaz you mentioned in your essay, like with Erelaz? I can't remember what it was.
For the Lindholm amulet?
I don't remember. You used an example. There was another. Never mind. I can't remember.
No, it's okay. I'm trying to remember too. But it's was it the wild one?
It's a Germanic word.
Was it the wild one?
Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can't remember, Tom. I'm sorry.
Had a meaning in that. But what you've mentioned also in the essay, this idea that the runes themselves you can't read the text with just the translation of the runes, but that you have to consider what you use the German Weltanschauung, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and also the item, the runes on the item on a part of the text, and the location that the item is in, all together form a holistic text to be read.
Yeah, so that's really hard to do. Let me just put that out there right now. I'm not saying that I have mastered that, because again, I'm only a runologist focused really on mostly like phonology. So the thing was that I wanted to do differently with that text, this dissertation, is that I wanted to look at the words themselves, which here's kind of the problem. Give you a little bit of context. Most runologists, especially from, we'll say, about 1980 to about maybe even 2014-ish, right around there, respectively, most of them only wanted to give you a translation, and they didn't take into context the material it was written on. They didn't take into context like the landscape. The landscape is also very important to focus on. They were only interested in just giving you a linguistic translation. So when you do that, it's kind of hard to talk about religious purpose and, magical function and so on and so forth. And so, for example, what I was trying to do was with the Bjorkatorp stone. It has beautiful alliteration everywhere. It has a curse formula on it. It has something that says like harmful prophecy on it. But my question was, how does it tie to the rest of the landscape? So like what you have up there is a picture of the stone with the inscription, but there are actually 3 stones and they form a triangle. And the one with the inscription is actually in the north. Like I already find that to be sort of significant too. Like why was it on the northern stone and not on one of the other 2 stones? So that's already something to sort of think about. The other thing to think about is that if you literally stood right there in the middle of those 3 stones and you threw a ball, baseball or something, you could actually kind of hit a grave mound. Like, it's actually that close, or at least it would land in a grave field, excuse me. And so these three stones were, in my opinion, protecting the whole grave field. So the thing is, though, is that the grave field is much older than the inscription on this stone. So the grave field was already there. Then these stones, we don't know exactly how they got there, but then this particular stone has this inscription on it that says, that this person had carved these runes, and that there's a curse formula here to where if you touch, I argue that it's if you touch anything in the immediate area, not just the one stone with the inscription on it, you're going to be subject to a curse. So it's stuff like that where I'm saying, like, we at least, as runologists, we at least need to take into consideration the archaeological evidence, the linguistic evidence, any sort of cultural, evidence whatsoever. We need to look at that before we start giving a translation, because, you and I were talking about someone who won't be named out of respect, but someone right before we had this talk, and how this person didn't know much about religion. So I would hope that this person wouldn't really want to give a lot of interpretations on some of these runic inscriptions, because if they're just looking at the language and they're not looking at any sort of religious practice tied to it or in the area or the archaeological stuff, honestly, you shouldn't be giving a translation. You shouldn't be giving a holistic translation. So you have to at least attempt those things. But this is why runology is an interdisciplinary field, because we require help from all kinds of areas.
That's fascinating answer. Yeah, I mean, that's how. I mean, my first degree was in film, and that's how we were encouraged to look at mise en scene and like look at other things within the text to get context. Like,
yeah, exactly.
And I think that's how everyone should regard all text, like poetry or whatever. So why shouldn't runes be different?
Yeah, exactly. And if your intention is to make something that's more permanent, you're going to do something like the Bjorkatorp stone that you just showed us. If your intent is to sort of have a more, immediate effect, or you want to impact the landscape in a watery area somehow, then you're going to do something like the Lindholm amulet, where you're depositing it purposely in a bog. My favorite inscription, which you and I think I talked about a little bit, is the Egya runestone, for example. And look at the context here. Like, first off, it's already really, really hard to translate, because, there are so many different ideas on, as far as like, what do people think that the Egya runestone means? I personally agree a lot with someone named Grönvik, because he has just done a tremendous amount of research on it. But what I'm trying to get at here is that this stone is just beautiful. It has like, do not, actually, I have my translation right in front of me. So here we go. So there is a ton of alliteration here. So you're not going to hear the alliteration in the translation, but basically there's a ton of sound alliteration. There are a bunch of words that are constantly repeated, and a lot of them say like do not, or this here, I'll actually just read it to you. So it's this is my translation. The stone is neither scored with a sax nor met by the sun, neither the one who is crying out over the naked kinsmen or outlaws, in other words, wild men, shall seek out this place. Let the dead rest in peace. That's not going to get into that, but that's kind of a paraphrastic translation. Over my kinsmen did the wild one send a corpse wave. So it's a capsizing on a boat. The rowlocks were worn out by the corpse wave in the drill-tired masthead. Who brought the host, i.e. the crew on the boat, over to the other land beyond? The manfish from the ferny currents, swimming with great haste from the land of the fen folk. And so what I wanted to say is like, there's your translation. Now what? So what's really cool is that we know, for example, that this stone was obviously carved at night. It wasn't carved with an iron knife, which is actually a folklore practice. There are all kinds of attestations where you go cut a branch, but in order to do that, you can't use a knife, and you have to do it before the sun rises. So
I did cover a whole load of them without realizing this translation of the Egya runestone in my Holy Holes documentary, where several of the I can just mention in Scotland they have to strip a piece of mutton bone without using metal, and there's all these tree to make the holes in the tree in Scandinavia and England. Now here, specifically in Devon, they do this idea that you have to, if you're going to make the hole in the tree, you have to use just wooden wedges. You can't use metal.
There you go.
Do it specifically do not do it in the waning moon. Exactly.
There
as it
you
says.
go. Yeah, exactly.
So it's
So
really
you have to
fascinating.
do it at night. And I'm glad you brought in those extra examples. Maybe I can shove them into my book. I'm kidding, but it's already done.
I'll give you the sources I use for them. I'll give after.
Actually, no, I'd still like to follow up on that. That's great. So yeah, thank you for that. So now we have folklore to bring into the interpretation of this inscription as far as why it says a particular thing. But the other thing is too is that this stone was specifically meant for the dead. So it was actually found flipped upside down. Now, what it's doing is there aren't any bodies underneath this particular stone, but instead there are objects under the stone, in which case is like flint or even some sort of like carving tool or something like that. But what I have argued is that it's just this metonymic device, basically. Like, Tom, let's say you were lost at sea, your family was distraught, but they had your rings and your necklaces. They're going to go ahead and bury those to sort of make peace, or in any way that they can, because they don't have your body. And so that's kind of what I argued for the Egya runestone.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
that's just another example of just putting things into context of like the landscape and then the interpretations. And so, yeah.
There are barrows without bodies in as well, which is presumed
exactly
people who died at sea and things. So the burials go ahead without a body, just as they do today. The grieving process is culturally different in different contexts, but there's it's the same emotions involved. And
exactly.
I can also mention on the folklore subject that late idea of Odin. I've seen a Swedish example where he can be where he's no longer seen as a god, where he's seen as a devil. That time when they say you can carry a piece of iron with you and throw it at Odin if you see him to get rid of him.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure if that was, at the time I thought that's just because of a widespread thing in Europe of iron being a way to avert evil, and Odin by that time being seen as a devil. But maybe this metal aversion thing actually was earlier associated with the gods, or
I think it was. I mean, because it's not even just Odin. I mean, there are all kinds of tales with trolls, for example, too, where you throw hot iron at the trolls and that gets rid of them too. So it's like some sort of like you're saying, like evil spirit. And so in that case, Odin was probably rendered to some sort of evil spirit or some sort of like lesser god. And so that would be one way to get rid of them. So it's a very old tradition. Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a friend, for example, that sometimes she doesn't work with iron because, she practices, but she doesn't, use iron a lot because it's just not part of her practice. And for some reason, she doesn't resonate with using it or whatever, because it's supposed to advert spirits. So but anyway, it's definitely an older practice. And
I mean, it's not related to runes, but I just like to know whether it was associated with, because only like telluric entities like the fairies and elves, or whether also the gods had some.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Because there are like prohibitions against weapons in certain temple and Germanic heathenry, and whether that was the weapon. The fact, I mean, Frey as well didn't like to have bloodshed in his.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking of too.
Is this just the metal, or is it blood? I don't know. It's worth considering. It's something we won't go into. Another, you did mention earlier the horns of Galahus, and how you mentioned them, and people, and you consider them magical items. I was very interested to hear and read you saying that the horns themselves, the depictions of the people may depict, in accordance, you got this from Hartner, I understand. They depict runic postures, like human bodies and adopting runic postures, rather like what people now call rune yoga.
So one thing I can say about Hartner is that his ideas about them being tied to runic shapes, I think those ideas are extremely valid. I mean, if you look at them, I'm looking at them, right now, there are all kinds of figures that are shaped in like the Perthro runes, the Sowilo runes, arguably some sort of like Elhaz runes. But what I will disagree with Hartner on is his linguistic interpretation of it. Without getting into too much detail here, basically, I argued that his linguistic interpretation of it just didn't make sense. Even other people too, like Elmer Antonsen, also said like his linguistic interpretation didn't make any sense. So in other words, they would be like, P and then Z or something like that. But it didn't make sense. But what does make sense is that those clearly do look like runic figures. I mean, it's quite obvious to me. So yeah, the whole like runic yoga thing, people say like, it's a modern practice. I mean, it is. I mean, it kind of started with like Marby and Coomer and that school. But at the same time, it's, it makes you wonder too, like you see depictions like this of human beings in the shapes of runes if it wasn't like an older practice.
Yeah, I really recommend everyone to check out Scott's two-part series on the horns of Gelahus, because there's some really interesting interpretations of the whole thing, the runes, the images, the horns, like as a whole, which I believe you were saying it was a kind of immortal way to become immortal.
Yeah, it's immortal in the sense of like one's name never dying out, which is extremely Germanic, of course.
Yeah,
too.
well, it's very Indo-European.
Very Indo-European, yep. And I talk about it in those videos too. So if they want to go check that out, I do tie it to some Indo-European things, and of course, I also tie it to like sacred, rituals regarding hunts and whatnot too. And there are some figures on there which are not Germanic, which is kind of interesting. They're more like Greek. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding those two horns. But yeah, no, definitely, if they want to know anything more about those two horns, they should check out the two videos, because it's probably like an hour's worth of information right there.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I did want to question, since you brought it up, like when you tried to say tie the hunt to Odin because of his role in later folklore, I always perceived that the wild hunt was something that a sort of coping mechanism of Odin to deal with Odin and his associations as like lord of like an army of the dead, and I thought the army became a hunt in later folklore, in my opinion. Or do you believe that Odin had an association with hunting earlier on?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I don't know, the Menabund, right? These tribes who were involved with these wars were probably also the people who were doing the hunting too. So I wouldn't make the distinction so quickly, in my opinion. I would say that they're all tied together in that sense. I don't think that the wild hunt was I don't think it was very early. I think it's really old. I mean, because we also have like the Harlequin, for example. We have Indo-European attestations of this wild hunt idea. So we can talk about that more if you want to. Maybe we can get some more information together for a video or something. But there's
another time. Yeah, there's lots to say about it. But yeah, let's stick to runes for now. The other thing I'd like to talk about is some of the divine associations of runes. Whether the runes themselves, to what extent the runes were seen as coming from the gods or Odin specifically, like the Nolaby runestone, the inscription there is Runo Raginakundo, apparently translated as runes of divine origin, and something similar on the Sparlursa runestone, perhaps. But what do you think? Is it something that goes back to the origin of runic literacy in Germanic culture? That this idea that they potentially have a divine gift. Similar beliefs, like, for example, that Hermes was gifted literacy to mankind.
Yeah, 100%. So the Nolaby runestone, I actually discussed that in my dissertation too. Oh my God, I'm going to read this one to you. It's very short, but it actually covers a lot of your questions previously too. So it says, I, the rune master for Hakuthus, prepare a bright, divinely derived rune, and then it's a bunch of gibberish garbled language. And so actually I loved that this just came up right now, because we have this formula here. In there are two things I want to say about it. It doesn't say that so and so carved the runes. It says that so and so carved the one rune. And people have interpreted that to mean the whole message, which is fine too. Like they carved the whole inscription and it means one rune. However, what I argued is that the rune, or the secret message that they're talking about, is all of that garbled language that nobody can translate. So it's like, I, the rune master, prepare this divinely derived rune, and then a bunch of unspeakable stuff that we can't pronounce. And so you can see how this ties back really, really well with the Greek tradition that you were just talking about. So I wanted to go ahead and say that, but I'll go ahead and answer your question too about the divine principles here. Yeah, absolutely. So the runes are divine, right? They come from the gods. There's no arguing against that. It's actually on the Nolaby runestone. It's actually also in Havamal. There are several places where we find this. And what I wanted to sort of say here too, I've said this before in some of my videos, but hopefully I can, reach a wider audience with this statement. I get asked a lot, and every single time there's like this sort of like a gatekeeping question I get in a conference, and it's Scott, if you believe that runes are magical, then aren't they the same thing? The main question is, aren't they the same thing as the Roman letters? This is one of those questions too, where it's like, well, I could say one thing, and then one extreme is going to say, yay, and then the other extreme is going to be like, not so good. So the thing is that I do not believe that they are the exact same thing, but let me explain. So the reason why linguists and runologists want to say that the Roman letters are the exact same thing as the runic alphabet is because it is a writing system. I do not equate those two things, though. And the reason why is because, for example, when the Roman system was brought to the Germanic tribes, it was completely devoid of any mythic connotation, right? There actually are myths as far as like it being tied to the Greeks and, it coming from a divine source, and then the Romans coming from a divine source. But when the Romans became Christian, that is when they brought the writing system to the tribes. And so while this writing system in Latin may have been, of course, a sacred ecclesiastical language, there aren't any there aren't any mythic connotations tied to the Latin alphabet by the time it's given to the tribes, or however you want to talk about runic origins. But I wanted to say that because within the runes themselves, they are directly tied to a mythic paradigm and a mythic world. And this is also tied to the Weltanschauung, or the worldview that I was talking about before. So you can't talk about them the same way, because the same person who's executing these runes that's saying like, I am the Erelaz, I am the crazy one, or something like that, the wily one. They're also, of course, working within a paradigm that's tied to Odin. They're working with a paradigm in which runes are mythic, runic mysteries and runic characters. They're placed more in this sort of like mythic and ritual context, whereas the Roman system, again, when it came to the tribes, it was devoid of all mythic connotation. So that's what I mean, because people will say like, well, can't you write a curse on, or basically if I perform a curse on a piece of material, and they would say like, well, if I write this in runes and I say like, I curse this person, is it going to be the same thing as if I write it in Latin, the Latin system, and say I curse this person? I would say, well, sure. I mean, and the reason why is because if you look at like the Greek system and the Greek tablets, like the lead tablets, there are all kinds of...
Here in the West Country of England, we have at Bath loads and loads of lead curse tablets from the...
Yeah, I've heard about those. Yeah. So exactly. So they would say like, linguists would be like, oh, we'll see, they're the same thing. But going off of what I just said about all the mythic context and the ritual context and everything that's sort of embedded in that worldview is no longer there if you equate it to someone just writing, in Roman characters on a clay tablet or a lead tablet and throwing it down a well for it to break to deliver the message. They're both modes of magic, but they're not the same system. So I really don't like it when a lot of runologists say you have the Latin system, you have the runic system, or if you believe in the Greek theory, you have the Latin or the Greek theory and the runic system, they're one-to-one. And I don't believe that whatsoever. And in fact, I find it kind of a lazy, way to just be like, yeah, they're the same thing. It's like, no, I mean, it's a little more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I mean, I always think there's something, I agree with you, but I do think there's something in the fact that in Egypt, Thoth gave hieroglyphs, and then he's equated with Hermes, and Hermes gives written language to the Greeks, and then
exactly. There's this tradition.
And then Tacitus from the earliest date is equating what I presume is Wotanaz with Mercury. And why is it that this consistently happens from going from the Romans right into like the medieval period of Odin being equated with Mercury? Because he's not, not with Jupiter, who's obviously the chief god. I thought it must be partly because of association with the dead and partly because of the association with writing. And that
No,
was
I
quite.
agree with you. I do agree with you. I think there are definitely some connections there. And that's kind of my point, is that you had this long tradition of these myths tied to the origins of these systems. But then when the Romans brought their system in, it was devoid of mythic connotation now because they were Christian. So it basically, when they brought the Roman system north, there wasn't, there was just no origin theory, like a mythic origin theory. But the Germanic tribes have their own, obviously, too. So,
do you think that the idea of, because the word rune hasn't had linguistically has no specific ties to characters or written script originally, and I know
right.
it's cognate in Gaelic is just means secret, and it's
Yeah.
pretty similar, right? So presumably it meant the same thing, but
Yeah.
and then in Finnish runo is like a song. So do you think that the word, like the mythology of runes and the associations with Wotan were originally, it pre-existed the existence of a written script in the Germanic culture?
Yeah, I do, 100%. And I believe it was tied to oral tradition, maybe even oral stories. And if you look at the word runo, for example, in Finnish, I talk about this in my dissertation as well. So there are articles out there. So for your audience, there are articles out there that say like, oh, this is not the same word as rune. So let me put it in a better context. Right around the Proto-Germanic period, around that time, that's when the Germanic tribes gave that word rune to the Finns. And it was not just that word. There were all kinds of words that the Finns borrowed, and this is one of them. And this word, because of the way that it looks in the language, it clearly is closer to like a Proto-Germanic form. And so it's very old. And what it means in Finnish is, like you were saying, Tom, just like a song or a story. It's sort of, and tied to oral tradition and passing on these mysteries and myths. So yeah, definitely. But what I wanted to say is that there are people out there who will say like, oh, that's not the right word. It actually is tied to this other thing, which means like a row. And I just want to just stop that right there. If you do come across that argument, it's not entirely valid, because you can argue on more nuanced linguistic grounds that it actually does just mean rune. So without getting into the linguistic details.
Cleared that up.
Yeah.
So on the same topic, in Rigstula, Rig sires is a blonde child called Jarl and names him Rig after himself and teaches him the runes.
Yeah.
So we have seemingly a separate divine origin myth from the one that Odin gave him there. But and then it says only the youngest son of Jarl, called Connor, the first king, is the one of all his children, the only one who learns runes. The others learn more other kind of aristocratic warrior pastimes, hunting and whatever. But runes are specifically limited to one guy. I could just read the passage if we've got time. Forthwith grew up the sons of Earl. Games they learned, and sports and swimming, taming horses, round shields bending, war shafts smoothing, ash spears shaking. But King, the youngest, alone knew runes eternal and runes of life. Yet more he knew how to shelter men, to blunt the sword edge and calm the sea. He learnt bird language to quench the fire flame, heal all sorrows and soothe the heart, strength and might of 8 he owned. So here it's very clear that like the learning of runes is accompanied by a whole load of what I can only describe as magical skills.
Well, it's just interesting because, like, as you were reading that passage, I was constantly thinking of like Ynglinga Saga too, and how Odin is able to do all of those things. Yeah. So again, you have like an emulation aspect again right there, But yeah, no, that's a good.
The king is always Odin in a sense. The king is because
in a sort of lesser sense, but yeah. And while he's a king in that depiction, I do believe earlier that I'm not so sure how much it had to do with class, as as we understand it now, as much as it did actually. It was reserved for a specific subclass of people to actually carve runes. So
it kind of ties in with what you said before about how earlier Germanic culture was more the runes are associated with a specific. You think it became more democratized as the Germanic culture progressed?
And that's what the texts show us. That's what I should say the corpus shows us. Yeah. Just because the usage was different, less alliteration, less poetry. I mean, don't get me wrong. Of course, you had all kinds of, crazy poetry like throat kvite and all that stuff too. But like as far as on the actual runic inscriptions later, we'll just say that the intent and the purposes were a bit different.
It does seem like that there was no effort to at all in the culture from if we're interpreting from this passage on like the religious origin of runic use, that there was no desire to make literacy widespread within the culture. And that echoes what we know about the Druids, who they spent 20 years of their lives like learning these oral traditions, and they weren't very interested in learning much literacy, and they certainly weren't interested in teaching other people their oral traditions. It was something that was that's like in India, the lower castes just aren't allowed to read the Vedas originally. So something like that, perhaps.
Interesting that they're not allowed. But yeah, no, I believe something similar does play that role. I remember listening to a talk by Thomas Dubois. He's really an excellent researcher, and he was up with the Sami. He's known for studying a lot of the Sami, for example. And I remember when I was listening to him give his talk on his research and being over there and studying with them, that they said that they basically wanted to keep their oral tradition and their oral stories so it could sort of keep growing and be alive. So that way, if they dedicated it to text, it couldn't grow anymore. So they didn't really want to document it. Yeah. So I think there's something that I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, it's hard to prove, obviously, but it's
obviously, but yeah,
it's comparative cultures there. There does seem to be something in it. Yeah. Have we got time to go over? We're running out of time. If anyone's got any super chats that you wanted to send them in now. But before then, I would like to say a bit about the use of runes in sounds, to ideographic use of runes as individual signifiers of concepts, rather than just the phonetic values. An example, like there's several invocations with tier rune, sometimes used in a 3 tiers. So if people interpret that to mean literally just say tier, like triple invocation of the god, maybe, or the Yera rune on the Stentoften stone, which I think you've interpreted as meaning what the rune means in a rune
harvest. Yeah, I actually even cited Benoit on that one. We were talking about Benoit, beforehand, and so I cited Benoit on that interpretation because he actually says not only does it represent year, but he actually says it also represents the 2 cycles. So I thought it was kind of an interesting.
The 2 halves of the year.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was at least worth contemplating. Yeah.
And did you get any pushback for citing Alain de Benoit?
What was funny is that I did from a personal friend of mine, but it wasn't really pushback. At first, he was like, "You should be really careful about citing Benoit," and I was like, "Okay, well, whatever." That wasn't really a big deal. My committee didn't have an issue with it, but where my committee did have an issue, definitely had an issue with me citing flowers. And what was funny is that my advisor was 100% supportive. And my other 2 people on my committee were kind of indifferent. But there was one person from the Scandinavian department that pulled me aside. I remember I went down in his office and we were talking about my dissertation. And he goes, "So I noticed that you cite Stephen Flowers." And I was like, "Yeah." He was like, "Well, I just want you to know that's basically like career suicide." And I'm like, well, why? Like, what's going on here, And he goes, "Well, you just shouldn't cite him because, he's tied to X, Y, and Z, which are mostly rumors anyway. But like, he's tied to all these things and he's a terrible person. And, if you cite him, you're never going to hear the end of it. So I really recommend you don't do that." And I looked right at him and I said, "Look, person, I said, his arguments I find are valid and very valuable. I don't care about what he does in his personal time or his personal life." And I find this like, when I wrote my dissertation, I was like, sort of like using his work as building blocks for me to write my work. So, cause he focuses on semiotics too, but from a different perspective. But yeah, no, I definitely
Edward Thorson or Stephen is the same person as Stephen Flowers.
Person, yeah. Edward Thorson.
Yeah.
What's that? Sorry.
I was saying the same thing you were. I think I was just explaining who he
Oh,
is.
yeah, Edward Thorson, Stephen Flowers, same guy, different pen name. But I also, here's a funny story too. The thing is that with the majority of these academics, they're like, if they cite anything by Flowers, it's going to be his dissertation or his book from Peter Lang from 1986. He actually has new revisions that came out later, and they refuse to cite them because it's not published in Peter Lang. So they keep going back to the one from like 86 with Peter Lang. And it's weird. So I looked at his later editions and I'm like, oh, wow, look here in the foreword, he actually addresses all kinds of people saying you're creating arguments about how runes aren't magic and stuff. And he refutes them. So like, it's just kind of weird how people just want to, like, oh man, that's an evil person, I don't want to know anything about him. Like, it's just like, you can't objectively just look at the information. I mean, and so it was really funny because I brought in actually a lot of citations from him, from his books, from his first edition and his third edition, and a semiotic theory that he had for an interpretation of the Lindholm amulet too. So, but yeah, no, I got a lot of pushback.
I didn't realize that the academic runology was so lacking in an analysis of the magical component of runes or magical uses of runes, that Stephen Flowers' work from the 80s was still like a really necessary text to refer to.
Oh no, he was really a necessary text in the 80s. And in fact, it was respectively, I think it was a little bit easier to talk about runes and magic in the 80s. Whereas as it got later, people were just throwing the word around to just mean nothing really, and so when I started to talk about runes and magic, I had to really set some very clear objective parameters for people to argue against. And that's how I got people to finally listen to me once they realized I was actually creating, I established my own, definition and everything of what I would call runic magic in the dissertation, which is actually not a universal translation. You can't do that because then you start getting into really difficult territory. So I defined magic as it would be perceived in that time for the rune master the best I could.
It's such a fascinating topic. I could go for another hour, but I don't want to break my rule of 1 hour. I wonder if we could quickly, though, finish off, just one of my favorite runic combination, magical one, is in the thumbnail for this video, the alu one, which generally translated as ale, but obviously doesn't just mean beer. And you had a very interesting interpretation of it, where you compared it to soma, the Indian hallucinogenic, magical and deeply religious substance. And this, could you elaborate on that before we?
I can a little bit. Basically, it might be connected to ale, but the thing is that I more adhere to Ptolemy's argument, in which case it's tied to Hittite, which I'll be very, I'll show all my cards here. There are issues with his suggestion too, especially among Indo-Europeanists, and how he's reconstructing that word. But it does tie very closely into being in an ecstatic state and being in another state of mind. And
Order.
Yeah, exactly. Order. And being, or like raising a sort of woad self, or something like that. So I do believe that it's tied to that. And Ptolemy's argument, while it does have issues, is even supported by Elmer Antonsen, who is the complete opposite of runes are not magical at all. So even he's saying, and he's actually a linguist and a phonologist, so he really knows his stuff. And so he was basically like, look, there are kind of some issues with this reconstruction, but the semantic field is still kind of there. And so, yeah, I mean, I would have to, and to go into that further, I mean, we would probably have to do another video so I could talk about like the linguistic cognates and stuff like that. But that's kind of how I resonate with it, is just that ecstatic state, and also being related to soma. So the thing is with soma, with alu or ale or nectar, all those things, like nectar, for example, means to overcome death. So, it's like, there's got to be something there rather than just some sort of profane beer that I'm going to drink. So there has to be something else there.
I personally was very interested in your interpretation because it tied in so much with what I was thinking in my world tree video. I put in a video earlier this summer about in the different Indo-European cultures having this function of a drink, a ritual beverage, which was originally probably mead and changed to wine and soma in different cultures, but remained mead in Germanic culture. But this is in burial context. Why are they burying, in the earliest Indo-European burials, burying people with these mead vessels, these clay pots and things? And I think that it's something that there's this idea of it changing states, and this when you're in life, when you're drinking this ritual alcohol, it isn't just alcohol because it's accompanied by a ritual that is about changing the state of being, and it's associated with the underworld somehow. That's my opinion.
No, I agree with. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that too. Maybe I can do a video actually on Alu or something. But no, I believe semantically and just like without getting too narrowly like focused. So I'm going to zoom out again, like I was saying, to look at things holistically. Alu doesn't make sense for it just to represent some sort of profane ale or something like that. So it's probably referring to, at the very least, that ecstatic state. So, yeah, I mean, it's also interesting too that it's Alu and you don't find anything with like mead being used, right? I mean, it's that particular state of mind. So,
and its context in Anglo-Saxon burial urns and on the bracteates, it's always accompanied by this figure that's usually interpreted to be Odin. It's just there's something going on, and
and there are Alu is actually even tied to a lot of like curse formulas too. So you'll see inscriptions with like alliteration and whatnot, and with a curse formula, and then it ends with Alu, and so therefore too, it's like it's gotta again represent something more on this sort of religious spiritual scale.
Someone's asked a question. We'll just end with this. What is Alu god? My opinion, Odin.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, like a compound actually, like Alu god.
There's that figure which says Alu god.
Yeah,
and also another whole kettle of fish. But between it, there's a swastika, and because the swastika is on these bracteate images, also accompanied by the Alu inscription and this figure that's usually interpreted as Odin, I'm going to guess that the swastika is also a symbol of Odin, despite what Hilda Ellis Davidson has said it being a symbol of Thor for so long. I just don't think that's true anymore.
That actually comes from like the 19th century. They started as far as the swastika and the Thor hammer. I actually did a video on the Cincinnati runestone, which is an American find. But I talked about it there. Basically, there's a swastika on that stone, but it was carved in the 1900s. And so I had to look into the literature and see like, what did they think the swastika meant in the 19th century? Not what does it mean right now? And so, yeah, that's actually what I was finding. So she's probably just going off of Cleesby Ferguson and, Grimm as far as like the swastika representing the Thor hammer. Yeah.
I thought she invented that idea.
No,
she was
no,
for it.
She didn't.
Doesn't seem to be any evidence to connect it to Thor at all, actually, when I looked into it. So,
I think it's just an earlier proposal that just kind of became conventionalized. So, but yeah, it's a little bit older. Yeah. But I mean, it could be connected to Odin somehow. But again, how do we interpret the swastika? It's difficult. It's in that time period.
I think I might do a video on it myself with it's the bracteates. I think are the key, because these bracteates are several ones that are connected to Odin for different reasons, and they're always accompanied by a swastika when he's there. So and also Alu runic combination and the swastika together. So I think there's some kind of these three things together. So Alu god, in my opinion, Odin. That's
also with bracteates, you might have like Alu and then Odin and then a swastika or something like that too, right?
Yeah, that's what
So
there's a few of those.
That's a good point. Yeah.
It's worth looking into. I hope someone knows more about it than I do, does a thorough research, but I might do a video on it anyway. But Dr. Scott Shell, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been fascinating talking to you.
Thanks so much, Tim.
I'd like to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
Good night.
Night.